All right, guys. It's after school, just waiting for my football game, so I thought I'd get on here and continue where we left off earlier with the Civil War summarization sheet here. All right, now that war has been informally declared, let's talk about how the two sides raised enough money to fight this war. Okay, pretty much both sides are going to follow the same format. Right, they're either going to make new money, use paper money, and then they're going to borrow money. Okay, and one of the ways that they make money, for example, in the North, is they're going to sell $2.6 billion worth of government bonds. Most of these are to the American people in the North. Some of them are to other countries, but they're going to sell government bonds. All right. Also, at this time period, they're going to raise tariffs and taxes. In fact, one of the things that they do is they institute the first form of the income tax. Eventually, as the war progresses into the second and third year, they're going to begin printing more paper greenback money. Okay, that's going to result in about an inflation rate of 80% or more in some points in the war. Okay, in the South, it's going to be very similar. Now, the problem, though, in the South is that it's going to be a little bit hypocritical, where they're trying not to create a big strong central government. They want a confederacy, where the states have the power. And so the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis, who is the president, is going to call on the states to contribute funds. Some states will contribute willingly, some states won't. Some states will raise taxes and some won't. Eventually, by the end, they too will institute a form of the income tax. But it's not going to produce as much money as the North, obviously. They'll also sell bonds. They'll print even more money than the North, and their inflation rate, in fact, goes as high as 9,000%. All right, so very, very high inflation rate. Now, one of the reasons why the North is so successful at raising more money is they begin to reinstitute this centralized banking system. All right. And it should be like reinstitute. And it's going to be similar to the Bank of the United States. Okay. Whereas in the South, they're going to be against that, very Jeffersonian, Jacksonian-like, and they're going to be against this. All right. Some of the things that come from the North that you should probably know about in terms of raising the money is the Whig or the Northern Republican Congress. Now that there's very few Democrats left in Congress, they're going to be able to have control of Congress and make and pass any laws that they want. Because again, they don't recognize the South as leaving the Union. So when it comes to making laws, they don't need the South to vote. If everybody votes in the North who was there and they vote for it, then it's passed. And eventually, after the war is over, all those laws that were created during the war will have an impact on the South. All right. So the Whigs, or the Northern Whigs that are part of the Republican Party, they see an opportunity to pass this Henry Clay type of economic system. All right, and so some of the things that are passed are like the Morrill Tariff Act. They passed the Homestead Act, which we'll talk about more in the next unit. But selling off land in the West. They passed the Morrill Land Grant. All right, which goes to businesses, and then they passed the Pacific Railway Act, all right, which grants the Transcontinental Railroad to go through the North. All right, so these are just four of the important acts that are done that are part of this national banking system that will have an impact after the war as well. Okay. Now, when we start comparing the North and the South and their efforts to raise the armies, again, they're going to be very similar. Even though the South doesn't want to, they kind of recognize that there's going to be a need to be very controlling of the people. All right, in order to fight a war, you need troops, and sometimes people who don't want to do it, are going to have to be drafted. So the first thing that happens in the North, for example, Lincoln calls up 500,000 volunteers after Bull Run. All right. Once he realizes that that's not going to produce enough, and we don't get enough, I believe it's 500,000. We could just put that. Once he realizes he doesn't get enough, or that the war is actually going to go on longer, he begins to institute a draft, all right, or conscription. All right. Eventually, this will lead to the New York City draft riots between the Irish and the blacks, basically. So, in essence, and I'm not going to put detailed notes here, but understand that the Conscription Act, they're going to call up anybody from 18 to 50. Now, they will, draftees have an option to pay $300 to opt out of it, or buy a substitute. So if you get drafted and you don't want to go and you're from a wealthy family, you could pay for somebody else to go, or you could pay not to go. Okay, that happened quite frequently. Now, these New York City draft riots, which again, if you were to watch the movie Gangs of New York, they do a great job of showing the riots themselves. It begins because the Irish Americans are upset about being drafted. They really look at this war as a rich man's war fought by the poor. Oftentimes, most wars are. And so the Irish began looking at this war as a war for slavery, and they get angry at the free blacks that live in New York. And what they basically are feeling, or feared, is that these blacks are going to take the whites' jobs once the whites are drafted to war. And then, so that there's a little bit of fear of losing their jobs after the war to the blacks. Also, there's this anger and fear of death, due to slave calls. Remember, just because the blacks were free in the North doesn't mean that they were welcomed a lot of times. All right. And when we talk about the social status and social ladder of people in the North, Irish were just right there above the blacks. Okay. In the South, it was same as the North, except more Southern elite became exempted. Okay, the South is going to have huge desertion problems by the time the war ends. And understand, in the South, these planter elites, they're not going off to fight the war unless they're automatically going to become captains or generals or whatever. But what really happens is the poor white Yemen farmers from the South are going to fight, and they have to raise and take care of their own farms and things like that. So eventually, by wintertime, there's always a problem with numbers, because a lot of the farmers are going to run back home, or go AWOL to go home and plant the crops for the next spring. So very similar in the way they handle it. There's a little bit more issues in the South. Obviously, they have less immigrants that can fight the war. They're not willing to pay, free the blacks to fight the war as they did in the American Revolution, things like that. Okay. Now, going back to the North just real quick, a lot of times when the Irish are coming over off the boat, they're going to be people at the end of the docks, and I think this is the part of the movie that I like a lot about Gangs of New York. As they get off the boat, they're being offered free food, free clothing, free place to stay, and then as they sign the paperwork, they don't always know or realize that they've just signed themselves into a military unit. And so as the war goes on, a lot of these units in the North are going to be made up of certain immigrant groups. So you'll have the Irish Zouaves, you'll have the Germans, you'll have the Swedes, so you'll have actually groups of units organized by nationality as they got off the boat. So It's going to cause some hostilities. The draft riots last for about 3 or 4 days till federal troops come in. And really what happens because of the draft riots are they're going to suspend the Conscription Act. Okay?